Yay. Nothing worse than when I do a whole class and forget to record it. How is everybody? Bright and early. Get our Friday going.
Good.
Good.
Glad it's Friday.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a beautiful weekend.
I know it is perfect out. It was like 58 degrees. It was great. It was really, really good. So, how's everybody doing after Wednesday's fire hose class? Morgan, did you take a look at the purchase and sale agreements?
Yes, I did. I read over it and wrote some notes and highlighted how to condense it and send it to your clients, like say it in a way that they understand.
Good for you. Good for you, because that's super important. So when you were going through it and highlighting it, was there anything that jumped out that didn't make sense to you?
Well, I went over it with Adam like 2 weeks before, so I'd already asked a bunch of questions on how. But I did have a question on like negotiating, like what would be the best way to negotiate for your client that if they want the world and you don't want to offend the seller?
Oh, they want to go in with a low offer. So the property, for example, is listed for 600 and they want to go in at 450,000 and just quote, try it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I'm going to throw that out to the universe and see if anybody on here would like to take a stab at that one. Don't? We're gonna do it. So part of it is about setting expectations, number one. But number two, I have a pretty strong belief that it's always better to make the market the bad guy or the market the one who is going to try and educate them, not you. Because if you just sit there and argue with them, you're not going to get anywhere, right? So if you say, well, that you're not going to get the house, the market isn't that slow, they're going to say, well, Morgan, we just want to try it. And if we don't get it, we're okay with that, right?
Right.
So number one, I think I would go to the multiple and I would pull up other properties that are closed. And there's actually a report that you can pull that shows how many or what percentage of properties closed over asking price and how much they closed. And so you could go to Anacortes, for example, and show them, look, even though you think the market has really slowed down, what has happened is prices have stabilized. There is more inventory to choose from, but prices are also not going down. There is something called trend graphics that is phenomenal. I will do a separate meeting on that because it's my belief when you are trying to educate a client that you let the marketplace do it. And you say, so here's the median price. Here's the average number of days on market. So this property's only been on the market for 4 days. Here are some other comparable sales that have closed in that neighborhood, showing that they've closed, in the high 500s or low 600s. You can pull up the tax records and say, look, even the tax assessor says it's worth more than this. And then I guess I would say, what is your end game if you don't get this house? So if you're dealing with an investor, it's going to be a little more difficult because investors purchase properties solely on the bottom line. So the rents may be low on the property and they haven't been raised in 10 years, but they will have the opportunity to raise the rents and get a better return on their investment. And the bottom line on that, Morgan, is sometimes with some people that, especially ones that are getting input from other family members, like a dad or a pastor or what, so one of the first things you want to find out is, are there any other decision makers involved in this process? And then be quiet and see what they say. Well, and they say, what do you mean? Well, are your parents going to be, coming to see the house if they're first time home buyers, grandparents, a friend that's a contractor? Is there anybody else that's involved in this? Because if they are, we need to get them involved from the beginning. If you're going to go out and show property, I would make sure that you make an arrangement to get those people there as well, because I can't tell you how many times you'll get a first-time home buyer under contract, and 2 days later, dad comes to see it, and dad's like, oh, God, I remember when you could have bought this house for $35,000, and there goes your deal, right?
Right.
So find out if there's other decision makers, get some statistics on the marketplace. You can have the conversation about the possibility of insulting the seller or not even getting your offer goes in so low that you don't even get a counter offer. But I guess I would say, is this really the house that you want to purchase? Or would you be okay if you don't get this house? If they say, yeah, whatever, we're not that wild about it, then they really don't care.
Right.
Sometimes you just have to go in at that lower price. And if nothing else, I would actually try and have the listing broker either strike the front page of the contract and say rejected so they can see that it was presented. And if there's no other offers, I would talk to that listing broker and see if you can get a counter offer out of them, even if it's back at full price, just to help educate your buyer, right? So those are just some ideas. Those are some tips. Anybody else have any other ideas? I've got Jay. I see you jumping on here. I know you've had a lot of experience negotiating. And I'm not even sure he's there. So anybody else? Any questions? Gavin, how'd you do going through the purchase agreement?
What was that?
How did you do going through the residential purchase and sale agreement? Any
It was
questions?
good. Yeah, I liked it. Yeah, made a lot
Good.
of sense.
Reading all the fine print on pages 2, 3, 4, and 5 are really kind of where you get into the weeds, and you've got to do it more than once and then practice actually filling it out, because that's when the questions actually arise. So anybody else questions on the purchase and sale? Jody, I know you filled out a lot of them. Any questions? You have any ideas about that person that wants to make the lowball offer, how you would handle it? Oh,
So,
you're muted. There you go.
Lowball offer. CMA, like you were saying, the trend graphics and what is sold in that area and the prices. And then I would ask them, how would you feel if you lost this place?
Right. That's always a good one. Flip it around and say, are you going to be okay if you don't get this property? It's different if you're making an offer on a property that's been on the market for 60 days and there's been no activity, and it is truly only worth a lower amount. Then you have to educate probably both the listing broker and the seller, although the listing broker, have a conversation with them. And I would just say, how did you arrive at this price? And if they say, oh, well, that's the seller's price, I told them it wasn't worth that much, whatever, then I would actually go in almost with a full-blown CMA to support your price on the purchase agreement, and be sure and stress, I'm not meaning to insult the seller, but this is based on the comparable sales that I can find in the marketplace. This is what we feel your home is worth. And we've also still got to get through an appraisal. So we're going to have an appraiser go in and tell us what they think the value is. So I'm more than happy to look at other comparables if you've got any to support your value. But these are the ones that I actually found. So you do sometimes have that situation, and there's a few of them out there. But if the home is truly worth the list price, that's going to be a different scenario. So conversations with listing brokers are gold, absolute gold. You can ask them anything you want. How did you arrive at the price? What are the seller's plans after they sell? Are they moving out of area? And sometimes they'll say, oh my God, they're in the middle of an ugly divorce. They've got to get this thing sold. The husband's moving to Timbuktu. And they just blurt it all out and tell you all that, which is great for you because you're representing the buyer. Now, if you're the listing broker, you're not ever going to get into that conversation with them. Or if they say, what do you think they'd take? You're going to say, I know they're going to take the asking price of the property. Beyond that, I can't tell you. So depending on which hat you've got on. So I hope that helped. Anybody else? Any questions as you were going through? Okay, we're going to jump into, financing and financing addendums today, because when we were in a really hot market, a lot of times when people had been actually what we call pre-underwritten, which in financing means they've given the loan officer all of their information, pay stubs, bank statements, all of that. They've run the credit report, and it's actually turned into a person called an underwriter. The underwriter in a loan is the person who makes the final decision on whether the loan will be approved or not. So it's always got to get through the underwriter. Now, the underwriter also has the right to review the appraisal on the property. They may want to see some repairs done. So just because they qualify, you have to remember when you're making an application for a loan, there's really two parts to it. Half of it is the credit worthiness of your borrower, but the other half of it is actually the stability and the condition of the property. You could have the most gold-plated buyer in the world with $2 million in the bank, but if they're buying a piece of crap tear-down house that has knob and tube wiring, an old roof with less than 5 years remaining, it's got a sagging foundation, the septic has failed, all of these things, the lender's going to say, hey, Mr. Buyer, you're a great buyer, but we are not going to make a loan based on the property. So remember that it's not just being able to qualify for the loan, the property also has to qualify for the loan. So that's something really important to explain to your buyers when they're looking at a property. Obviously, an inspector is going to call a lot of these things out for you. And they're going to be covering that. So you can actually have a buyer who has not picked out a property yet, make a full loan application with a lender, whoever your favorite lender is, and that lender can actually submit it to underwriting for approval. And so the approval is sitting there basically, okay, we've cleared everything. It's not, if you get a pre-approval letter, it's usually subject to a full credit report. It's subject to verifying their income. It's subject to a lot of different things. But once it's been through the underwriter, all of that has been cleared and the borrower has been approved. So half of your equation is now checked off. Now you just need to go find them a house that will qualify. And so being able to tell a potential seller of a property that my people are already pre-underwritten, and you're going to get a letter from your lender that states that. So all we have to do is plug the property in, is going to give the seller assurance that there's not going to be a glitch in their credit, that there's not going to be a problem with verifying their income. That's already all been taken care of. So it's always great to have a good rapport with a good lender, because you need to be able to have a conversation with them and say, I know you've talked to the Smiths last week. How did it go? Are they actually going to go into underwriting? Is there anything we need to be aware of? They may say, well, the problem is Mr. Smith's only been on his job for 10 days and he needs to be on his job a minimum of 30. So at least you know going in. The other thing that you may run into when you talk to that lender is, yeah, we had a conversation last week with the Smiths. I asked them to submit bank statements, pay stubs, all these things, and I haven't heard anything from them. They haven't supplied me any of that information. So at that point, it would be up to you to reach back out to your buyer and say, hey, it's Gavin, just checking in. I know you talked to ABC Mortgage last week, and I happened to have a chat with the loan officer today, and she said she's still waiting on quite a few things from you. And they may say, oh yeah, we're gathering all of that up. We're working on it. Great. When can we expect to have that to them? Can I tell them maybe you'll have it by Monday? Will that work for you? So you kind of need to stay in the middle and make sure that the wheels stay on the bus and the financing is moving forward. Because I always say that getting a mortgage loan is kind of like going to a dentist. People hate to do it. They have a fear that they're going to get turned down because of bad credit. They have a fear that that late payment they had to JCPenney's a year ago is going to kill the deal. They have a fear they're not going to qualify. So you have to kind of hold their hand along with the loan officer, especially if they're a first-time home buyer, and make sure that that application process continues forward. Although more experienced or older borrowers may not have been through the loan process in 15 years. So the last time they went through it, they literally just called their lender. The lender said, okay, money's ready, come get it tomorrow. They don't understand why. They feel like they're getting grilled having to go through, why do you need 3 months of bank statements? Why do you need 2 months of bank stubs? Why do you need verification of my employment? Why do you need all this stuff? I got money in the bank, I'm good to go. So it's going to depend on your borrower, but you need to have a general working knowledge of your financing. So if you haven't actually sat down with your lender to find out about different loan programs that are available and just start getting to know them, go to coffee with them and say, hey, are you going to be available on the weekend? I'm doing an open house on Sunday. If I get somebody that needs to be pre-approved, Are you going to be available by phone? Can I hook you guys up on the phone and you can have a quick conversation with them? That is super uber. I just can't stress how important that is, because some of the more seasoned loan officers don't work on weekends. So make darn sure you've got a good relationship, you've got a cell phone number for your lender, and it's somebody that you can get a hold of after hours and on weekends. And hopefully everybody does. If you don't, do it. Okay. Moving on. I am going to start with a video, and I'm going to screen share here. And this is off of YouTube. And so I went to YouTube and I went to Washington Realtors. Write that down. Because under Washington Realtors, if you click on, number one, subscribe to them, but if you click on them, all of these hotline videos are going to come up, and they range anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And they take deeper dives into a lot of these forms, a lot of the negotiating. And again, I would recommend watching at least one of these a day. I like the idea of time blocking for education, especially when you're new, that you spend an hour, maybe first thing in the morning, watching hotline videos, watching David Knox videos, watching Tom Ferry videos, whatever it is, and increasing your knowledge, because right now you are at the very, very bottom of your knowledge base. And so your main goal is to add to that knowledge base. I watch these all the time and I always learn something. I don't know how many of you were on the roundtable yesterday, but just going through offer counter offer and withdrawal of offer counter offer, we spent a whole hour on that one form. If you missed it, it is on our Facebook page, which looks like this. If you have never visited, sorry, let me close these. If you have never visited this page, I strongly suggest that you do. It's called Remax Whatcom County Inc. and Gateway. It's a private group. You have to be invited, and everybody on this call should have been invited to join. And down here on the page, there are business meetings that we've had and recorded. So if you miss a meeting, there's hotline questions that I put up there. There's updates on all kinds of things. So I would check in there at least once a week. It's a really good place to go. But for right now, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to watch this 7-minute video, because Annie Fitzsimmons is what we call the legal hotline attorney for Washington Realtors. This is a free resource that everybody has access to, and we use it all the time. You can send her questions if you're in the middle of a transaction and the other broker's telling you, we don't do it that way, or you don't have to do it that way, and you know that it is done that way. Sometimes just sending a question to Annie and having her clarify is enough to get things off of dead center. So here we go.
I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors legal hotline lawyer. This video is one of those in the series covering the revisions to the statewide forms released on March 3rd, 2021. This video is going to discuss Form 22A, the financing contingency. And the most significant change to the financing contingency is the inclusion of additional options that creates two different, very different types of financing contingency. Under our pre-March 3rd statewide form system financing contingency, buyer and seller only had one option for a financing contingency. And that financing contingency effectively gave buyer a financing contingency that stretched all the way to closing. And the only way that financing contingency would ever be cut off shorter than closing was if seller delivered what was known as a notice of right to terminate, Form 22AR. If seller delivered the 22AR, notice of right to terminate, then buyer would have 3 days to waive their financing contingency.
I'm going to stop for a second because I think I forgot to click a button. Is this coming through clear to you guys?
No, not really. I had to turn up my volume.
Okay, I'm gonna stop her and I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna stop sharing. I apologize. I forgot to click a button when I screen shared. Share sand and optimize. I apologize. Okay. Here we go again.
revisions to the statewide forms released on March 3rd, 2021. This video is going to discuss Form 22A, the financing contingency. And the most significant change to the financing contingency is the inclusion of additional option that creates two different, very different types of financing contingency. Under our pre-March 3rd statewide form system financing contingency, buyer and seller only had one option for a financing contingency. And that financing contingency effectively gave buyer a financing contingency that stretched all the way to closing. And the only way that financing contingency would ever be cut off shorter than closing was if seller delivered what was known as a notice of right to terminate, Form 22AR. If seller delivered the 22AR, notice of right to terminate, then buyer would have 3 days to waive their financing contingency. If buyer didn't waive the financing contingency, then seller could but was not required to terminate. If you like that style of financing contingency, that style of financing contingency is still available to you in Form 22A, Paragraph 2, Option A. And in fact, there's a check mark box for selecting either option A or option B. If you don't mark any of the boxes, it will default to option A, and buyer will have the old style of financing contingency. The only revisions to that concept, and these are not substantive revisions, is that the 22AR, what used to be called the notice of right to terminate that seller would deliver, is now called the notice to perform. Substantively, the form is identical to what it used to be. It's just entitled with a different caption, notice to perform, rather than notice of right to terminate. Buyer's still got 3 days to decide what they're going to do. If buyer doesn't waive the financing contingency, seller can terminate the transaction if they choose. The only other change is to reduce the default number of days for which, by when seller can deliver the 22AR. Used to be 30 days by default. It's now 21 days. But again, the parties can agree to any number of days they want. That's a default term. Option B is a completely different philosophy for financing contingencies. Option B mirrors every other contingency in the statewide form system, and by that I mean it automatically terminates or expires, waives, whatever word you like, on a date agreed by the parties. So by default, it is 21 days after mutual acceptance. And if you accepted that, then if buyer was an option B, a Form 22A, Paragraph 2, option B financing contingency buyer, then 21 days following mutual acceptance, buyer's financing contingency would automatically waive. Seller doesn't deliver a notice, buyer doesn't have any chance to change that outcome. On day 21, buyer's financing contingency waives. Prior to waiver, buyer can terminate the purchase and sale agreement. However, buyer only recovers their earnest money if buyer can provide the lender letter demonstrating buyer's good faith effort to obtain financing. This is the same lender letter that was required under the old version of Form 22A. The description of what's required in the lender letter hasn't changed at all. Lender's letter has to identify the date on which buyer made loan application, has to have been within 5 days of mutual acceptance, that buyer had sufficient funds to close the transaction had the loan been issued, and number 3, the reason the loan funds are unavailable. Now I want you to think about this in the context of option B. If we were still in option A and we got all the way to the closing date and buyer's loan didn't issue, it's pretty easy then for a lender to say, well, this is why it didn't issue. And it could even be that the lender ran out of time processing the loan. You can't rely on that if buyer has to terminate the transaction before you ever get to the closing date and deliver this letter to justify why buyer's loan funds would not have been available on the closing date in the future. What does that mean? It means, buyer brokers, buyer has got to get an underwriting approval or denial prior to the automatic waiver date of their option B financing contingency. So realistically, what does that mean to you, buyer broker? It means that you have to help your buyer understand absolutely how important it is that, number one, they hire a competent lender. Cannot be overstated. They've got to hire a competent lender, somebody who knows how to get the loan processed timely. Number two, buyer has to get all of their documentation that lender requires delivered to lender immediately upon lender's request, no delay. And then number three, buyer and buyer broker, you're going to have to press buyer's lender to get that loan package assembled and submitted to the underwriter as soon as possible, because buyer has got to get either a thumbs up or a thumbs down from this underwriter in time, buyer broker, for you to deliver a notice of termination based on the financing contingency to seller if buyer's loan is denied. You're gonna have to have that information from the underwriter so that lender can then write a letter showing the date of application, that buyer had sufficient funds, and that buyer's loan would not have issued on the closing date because it was denied by the underwriter for whatever reason they account for. Those are the big changes. With both option A and option B, buyer can still retain the protection of the low appraisal provision. In fact, the default now, if you don't mark any boxes on the preservation of low appraisal provision, which in option A is small Roman numeral 3 and option B it's small Roman numeral 2, if you don't mark any boxes, then the default is for preservation of the low appraisal provision, meaning that if buyer waives the financing contingency and you don't mark any boxes, or if you do mark a box, you mark the will not box, then with that, buyer does retain the protection of the low appraisal provision. Okay, there were a few other changes to the financing contingency, but that's the big one.
Okay. So she kind of jumped into the middle, but there were some really, really important things in that video. Number one, when we are looking at a financing addendum, I'm going to go back to screen sharing here. Here is our financing addendum, which by the way is Form 22A. You can always see the form number up here. You can see the revision date and you can see the total number of pages that are included in that. So financing addendum, standard upper part. The first part is really important because it talks about the type of loan that your buyer is going to be applying for. And it says the agreement's contingent on buyer obtaining, not just applying for, but obtaining or being approved for the following type of loan. A conventional first, which is the normal loan that a lot of people get. A conventional second, rarely see that. A bridge loan, which is where they're taking out, they own a property now, they want to purchase a new property, and a bridge loan basically gives them a loan on the property that they own against the property that they are going to purchase. It's a bridge financing. Once their home that they're living in sells, they pay off that bridge loan and move on with their new purchase. VA and FHA and USDA are all government-backed type of loans. The advantage there is lower down payment, more lenient underwriting. Their debts can be greater. There's something called a debt to loan ratio. And usually lenders say that your total bills, including your new mortgage payment and taxes and insurance, shouldn't exceed a certain percentage of your income. So for VA, that might be 45%. And for conventional, that might be 38 or 40%. So they basically, it's kind of crazy, but the government allows people to go farther into debt than a regular conventional loan does. A home equity line of credit is when they are borrowing against an existing property that they already own. Let's say they own a house free and clear. They pull $400,000 out by means of a home equity loan. So in other words, that's a lien against the property that is basically kind of like a revolving. So they borrow the $400,000, they can pay it off at any time, which you can anyway. But you can get a line of credit against a property that you own and not borrow anything. It's just sitting there waiting for you to borrow against it. Some people like to do that or other. So here you're going to put buyer shall pay either X number of dollars down or a blank percentage. Always, always use a percentage, because if you put a dollar amount in, let's say sales price was 500,000, lender said, or the buyer says, I want to put 20% down, and you make the mistake of writing $100,000 in there, which is 20%. But then the seller counters back at 520,000. Your buyer accepts it. 100,000 is no longer 20%. So you're always better. The percentage will fluctuate up and down with the sales price. So this is the amount of money that they're going to put down in addition to the loans. Here's where you have a really good opportunity to have a conversation with your buyer and ask them, so Mr. Buyer, you're indicating you've told me that you want to put about 100,000 down or 20% down. Let me ask you a question. Do you have those funds readily available? Are they in a checking or savings account? And then be quiet and see what they say, because you'll be shocked at some of your answers. Sometimes people say, well, I don't actually have it, but grandma's making me a gift of $100,000, so I'm going to be doing that. Great. Has grandma given you the $100,000 yet? Because in order for the loan to be approved, the lender is going to want to see that $100,000 gift funds from grandma. They want to see those in your bank account, because we've had situations where we get up to closing, grandma changes her mind, doesn't want to loan the money, and then the borrower is kind of in a world of hurt. But the lender is also going to require.
Lori, doesn't that money have to be in their bank for a certain period of time, like 3 months or something?
It's easiest if it is, because that's what we call seasoning the money. Because then you don't have to go through additional verification from grandma of where that money came from. If it isn't seasoned, grandma actually has to show her bank account, which, trust me, grandma is not going to want to do, of where that money came from. The lenders are funny. They want to follow the trail of the money, where it came from. They want to make sure grandma didn't borrow the money, or grandma didn't, I don't know. But once it's been there for a certain length of time, you don't have to go through verifying where grandma got her money. So it's always best to do that. But you need to find this out. Are they borrowing against a 401k? Are they borrowing against a retirement fund? Are they cashing in stocks out of their stock portfolio? There's so many different places that money can come from. And you need to know this, because you need to know if that money is liquid or not. Is it readily available or not? If it's in a retirement fund, it can take weeks to get that money back out of there. You have to make an application. You can only borrow so much. It's definitely doable, but that isn't considered readily available funds. We need to know this. Buyer shall make application for the loans to pay the balance of the purchase price and pay the application fee if required for the subject property within, and this defaults to 5 days. Okay. Now, here's the test. I'm going to stop our share for a minute. If we get mutual acceptance today, what is the last day that the borrower has, if we go with the 5 days, to go in and make that application and pay their loan deposit? Thursday. Is it Thursday? Trish says Thursday. Or somebody says Thursday.
I did.
Lisa did.
Is it 5? It's 5
days. And what did I say about counting the day of mutual?
Friday.
Attaboy, Jay. We don't count the day of mutual acceptance. Sorry. We don't count the day of mutual acceptance, and we got mutual acceptance today, or maybe we get it tomorrow, or maybe we get it Sunday. It doesn't matter, because 5 days and less are always what kind of days?
business days.
Good. Business days, which does not include weekends and holidays. So you don't count the day of mutual. And if it's 5 days or less, you don't count weekends or holidays. So your first day of counting your 5 days is going to be Monday. Okay. So you're going to go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I literally get a calendar out. Don't count on your brain being able to process this, because if you miss dates, sometimes you're screwed. Don't do that. Now, technically, you have until Friday at what time? Oh, Valerie was trying, but she's muted. Anybody? Come on.
9 o'clock.
9 o'clock. Good job, Allison. 9 p.m. However, how many lenders do you know that are working at 9 p.m. on a Friday night? Right? So don't be sitting around waiting, because basically what has to happen for a formal loan application is they have to get enough information from the buyer to be able to do what they call disclose them. The federal government says if you make an application for a mortgage loan, the lender has so many days to get a loan disclosure out to the buyer, right? So the buyer is going to get a loan disclosure from the lender saying you've made application for this amount of money on these repayment terms at this interest rate, and it's subject to or conditioned upon you providing this, and this, okay? So actually, in reality, a lender can make a loan application for your borrower on their laptop, sitting on the beach in Maui at 8:30 on Friday night. So technically it could be done. But if for some reason that buyer doesn't qualify for this loan, one of the things that you have to prove in order for that buyer to get their earnest money back is that they made application in the allotted time period. In this case, it's 5 days. So if they wait until Saturday to make that loan application, I mean, a week from Saturday, they don't qualify or they can't check that box, they may not be entitled to their earnest money back. That's one of the criteria to get your borrower's earnest money back in the event they don't qualify for the loan. So it's super hyper important. And you need to have that conversation again with your buyer when you're going through this contract, that you can't stress the importance enough of having them make their loan application and start getting all that documentation into the lender in a timely fashion. Okay? 5 days after mutual acceptance of this agreement for purposes. So then they actually spell out what the application means. They've provided financial information, Social Security, all that other good stuff. Waiver of financing contingency. Listen to this one. And this is something definitely worth a conversation with your buyers. If the buyer fails to make application within the agreed time, so they dink around and they do it on Saturday of next week, if they change the type of loan at any time without the seller's prior written consent, oh yeah, Trish, I think we're going to do a conventional. And then a week and a half later, you call the lender for an update and the lender says, oh yeah, the FHA loan is going just great. And you went, what? Whoa, I checked the box conventional. When did they change to FHA? Oh, they decided a couple of days ago that, it's better interest, lower down payment. They really want to go FHA. They have just changed loan type after that first 5-day period without the seller's permission. So that's that one. If they change, number 3, if they change lenders without the seller's prior written consent after the agreed upon time to apply for financing expired, those 5 days. During the first 5 days, they can go, so you may have a pre-approval from Caliber, and your buyer, after they go under mutual, decides to go shopping for lenders. And they end up saying, oh, I really like Dylan at Umpqua. He's got a better program. He's got better interest rates. I'm going to switch to Dylan over at Umpqua. If it's within that 5-day period, absolutely fine, no problem. No harm, no foul. But if it's after the 5-day period and they switch lenders without the seller's written consent, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen here. So if they don't make their application, if they change the type of loan, if they change the lender, get this, the financing contingency shall be deemed waived. They no longer have a financing contingency. It doesn't matter if they don't qualify. It doesn't matter if the appraisal comes in low. It doesn't matter about any of this. They have just waived this entire financing contingency, which is a pretty big deal. So I can't stress enough having a conversation with your buyers, not only about the type of financing, and you need to have your lender in this loop. Your lender needs to be part of your team. Your lender needs to be the one helping guide you down the road, talking to you about the different loan types. How is it working with this client? Yes, they're being great. They're getting me all their information. They should qualify, no problem. They've got plenty of money in the bank. They've been on their job 50 years, whatever, right? You need to know all this. I don't care how experienced they are not familiar with these forms, and it is our job to cover what I just covered. I have a suggestion. So hopefully you guys all now understand the 3 things that can happen if, in order to qualify to make the buyer lose their lending financing contingency. But what did I do? I told a little story with each one of them. I didn't just go through the paragraph because a lot of times when people are in the throes of a contract, they're intimidated and they'll nod at you like they know exactly what you're talking about and they are absolutely clueless. And then when you come back later and go, oh my God, you changed lenders, or oh my God, you changed loan types, or oh my God, you waited 2 weeks to make a loan application, they're going to go, yeah, Jody, what's the big deal? You're going to go, well, remember that paragraph we talked? I know. Yeah, I know. I remember you going through it. I think that telling stories to your clients, brief as they may be, are so much more effective because people, then you can see the light bulb go on in their eyes. Then you can see that they're actually understanding what you're telling them. And if at any time you're getting that blank stare, stop, put your pen down, put your computer down and say, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Is there anything that maybe you don't understand that I can explain more? Don't make them feel dumb, but make sure that if you see a glimmer of not understanding in their eyes, that you stop and have a conversation and make sure that they actually do. Because what they might say is, hey, Morgan, yeah, we have been talking to a couple of different lenders. So is that going to be a problem if I decide to go with a different lender? And Morgan's going to say, not if you do it in the first 5 days after mutual acceptance at all. But if you go beyond 9 p.m. next Friday, and you better know your dates and times, if you go beyond there and don't make full-blown loan application, you provide credit, you provide an application fee if applicable, all of that, then you in effect waive your financing. So it's super important. If you're going to shop, you do it now. Okay? That's the kind of conversation that will make you an invaluable person, broker, to your clients. They need to really understand this. All right. So we don't want to waive it. So it also goes on to say that if you waive the financing under this paragraph, it also constitutes a waiver of the appraisal. So if the appraisal comes in low, you can't even use that for an excuse to get out of the contract. Your host. So super, super important. Financing contingency. So here's the two. I'm at the bottom of the page, page 1. These are the 2 paragraphs that Annie was talking about. I will share with you that probably 95% of the time I see the first box checked. Why? Because that does not automatically waive your financing at the end of 21 days. Yes, Lisa.
You share the form.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah. I think after all these years, I'd be better at it. Okay, so here we go. So what I was talking about the waiver of financing contingency, my apologies. That's all right here under B. I'm on the financing addendum, B waiver. If they fail to make application, if they change the type of loan, if they change the lender, then the financing contingency shall be deemed waived, and it also waives the appraisal. All right here. Okay, so stop and spend some time on that with your clients. Now we're going to go down to the bottom of the first page, and we're going to look at the 2 different options for the financing. As I was saying, about 95% of the time, you'll see the seller's notice to perform checked, because that gives the, number one, I would say in over 50% of the cases, the seller doesn't deliver a notice to perform asking the buyer to waive the financing contingency that they have the opportunity to do under paragraph 2A. So on day 22, the seller has the right to deliver a notice to the buyer to either waive the financing contingency, or the seller will have the right to terminate the contract. This may happen when there's another offer in backup position that's better than the offer that you've got here. Or it may happen when the buyer's frankly been dinking around and they're not getting their paperwork in, and the seller's just feeling a little uncomfortable. They're 21 days in, they haven't seen the appraiser hasn't been out to the property, and they're like, what the heck is going on? I'm going to hold their feet to the fire, and I'm going to give them a notice to perform. So it says seller may give a notice to perform requesting the buyer waive the financing. Waive means it goes away. And the seller may give notice to terminate at any time 3 days after delivery of that notice. So back to my time frames. Let's say today is day 22 and the seller delivers the notice to perform. So the buyer has 3 days to decide what they want to do. So who can tell me what the last day and time that the buyer has to either deliver that, or if they do nothing, it's like they are delivering nothing. So the seller will keep the right to terminate. But when would that 3 days be up? We have mutual, or we have today is day 22. So your 3-day clock is ticking. When is that going to take me to? What day and time? 3 days. Chris, you're muted.
Wednesday,
At what time?
9.
Good job. Right? Everybody with me? Don't count weekends and holidays. Starts on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Don't forget, we do have Labor Day coming up. I already corrected a contract yesterday. Somebody had a closing date on Monday, which was Labor Day. It isn't going to kill your contract, but it's a rookie mistake and it makes you look bad. So actually look at your calendar and know your holidays when you're picking out closing dates and things like that. Side note on that. So the seller delivers the notice. The buyer has until Wednesday at 9 p.m. To either waive or not waive. If the buyer does not waive, we're going to get to Form 22 AR. Actually, I'm going to pull it up right now. Find it. Any forms open here? 22. There it is. Okay. This is called a Form 22 AR, a financing contingency notice, and it's kind of a toolbox for financing notices. So you need to remember this one, 22 AR, because it doesn't just cover the notice to perform. It also covers, so the seller has, if they check this box, this is what they would deliver on day 21. Seller requests the buyer waive the financing as provided in paragraph 2A of the 22A, which is the financing. If buyer does not waive, seller may terminate at any time 3 days after delivery of this notice. So it's delivered today. After 9 p.m. on Wednesday, the seller can terminate the agreement if they choose. Seller may not want to terminate the agreement. Seller may say, I like these buyers. I really want them to buy the house, but I want to kick them in the butt and get them going on their financing, right? So they can deliver this form and not deliver a notice to terminate. However, if they do decide after the 3 days to deliver the notice of termination, here is what your buyer is going to get. Seller provided the notice to perform at least 3 days prior. Buyer hasn't waived. Seller gives notice. Seller elects to terminate the agreement, and the earnest money is refunded to the buyer. There is no looping around, second chance. Oh, wait, I changed my mind. Wait. It doesn't work that way. Once the seller terminates, boom, contract is over. You're done. So if the seller gives you the notice to perform and you're representing the buyer and you've received this signed by the seller up here, down here, if your buyer says, no problem, I've been all the way through underwriting, I'm pre-approved, the appraisal's in, it's back, it came in good, there's no work, it came in at ask. Buyer is comfortable waiving the financing contingency. This is the form that you will use to answer the seller if they deliver that. Okay? So it actually is kind of nice because it kind of prompts you and reminds you, and a lot of times in these forms they do that. So we just covered that. Here's what she was talking about the appraisal less than sales price, i.e. what we call in the business a low appraisal. And they're not uncommon, frankly, especially in the crazy market we just came out of when people were escalating well above and beyond the asking price. And frankly, it was almost an emotional hysteria in some cases. People had FOMO. They were so afraid they weren't going to get a house. They threw caution to the wind. They had money in the bank, or maybe they had sold a house down in Seattle or Bellevue. They had tons of cash, or San Francisco, and they just came and they started throwing money on the table. They didn't care what the appraisal came back at. Well, our market has shifted and it's a better market now because it's a lot more stable. So this is going to be really important to your buyer, because the buyer is going to want to know what happens if the house doesn't appraise. And you, knowing your forms, are going to pull this one out and say, oh, look, you're covered right here. Appraisal less than sales price. Even if you have to waive your financing contingency, that's just your credit worthiness. We retain or preserve the appraisal Buyer's waiver of financing will not constitute waiver of appraisal less than sales price. So you're covered. So actually it's this one here. I'm still back on paragraph 1. Here's the paragraph 2 that Annie was talking about, which is the automatic waiver. So what happens with this one? After 21 days by default, you can fill in any number you want, 30. I've seen people actually fill in 1. It's kind of interesting because they want to preserve their appraisal. They've already been underwritten, but they want to preserve their appraisal coming in low. It's a strategy. Financing shall be conclusively deemed waived unless 21 days, 3 weeks after mutual acceptance, buyer gives notice of termination of this agreement. That's what Annie was talking about. This is an automatic. The seller doesn't have to deliver a notice of termination. The buyer doesn't get 3 days. This is just a hatchet that comes down on day 21 and takes away the financing contingency with the exception of the appraisal, which is retained if you do not check a box or you check the will not box. Either one accomplishes the same thing. So it preserves that appraisal. I covered a lot on page 1 and there's a lot of meaty stuff in there. Anybody have any questions before I move on? So we've talked about loan application. We've talked about what happens if you miss one of the things for the loan application. We talk about the 21 days notice to perform. A good listing broker will always deliver a notice to perform on day 21. You have a duty to your seller to do that. That being said, a lot of listing brokers don't want to deliver it because they don't want to scare the buyer. They don't want to make the buyer freak out. The seller says, no, I'm comfortable. I don't want to terminate the contract. I don't want to go down that road. And so a lot of times they don't get presented at all. But this is another one that you need to have a conversation with your buyer, because if they get a notice of that they have to waive their financing on day 21 and you haven't clued them in, they're going to freak out. Trust me. Doesn't the seller trust me? Oh my gosh, we're going as fast as we can. Well, I thought they liked me. If they personal things get involved at this point. They don't trust me. They don't like me. Well, I'll fix them. I'm just going to walk away from the contract. So if they know it's coming and you say, there's a good chance that we are going to get this, and here's what it means. It simply means that by then we need to be through underwriting, but you're still going to preserve your appraisal addendum, and that appraisal addendum doesn't have an expiration on it. Okay. But you need to have a conversation with your buyer so they know what's coming down the road.
I have a question, Lori.
Sure.
So if that paragraph 2A says financing is waived after 21 days, and the notice 22AR comes after 3 days, said that day number 22 is when seller is going to deliver that notice, financing is already waived technically. So it's just a notice.
Are you talking about B if we're using B?
Yes.
Okay, so if you're using
2A.
Okay.
I'm talking about 2A because we always fill in the blanks anyways. So it's by default is 21 days. It's not automatically waived, but it is technically waived on 21st day of the mutual. And seller delivering the notice 22nd day, that doesn't count, right?
So
It's just a notice.
Let me clarify. That's a really good question. So if you have used 21A, it says at any time 21 days after mutual acceptance, there is no, it's probably poorly worded, but there's nothing in here that says it has to be delivered on day 21. It can be delivered on day 22, 25, 28, 30, 32. It doesn't matter. But they cannot deliver it before 21 days. They can't deliver it on day 20. They can't deliver it on day 5. But they can deliver it on day 22. They can deliver it on day 30. And the same 3 days that the buyer has starts ticking on the day after delivery of the seller's notice to waive. On 2B, the automatic waiver, there is no notice from the seller, because it's already baked in to the contract. The termination or the waiver of the financing is an automatic. The seller doesn't need to get a notice. give a notice and the buyer doesn't get 3 days to think about it. So under A, if you're representing a buyer, it's a much better way to go because you've got at least 21 days and there's a chance the seller won't deliver it at all. Or if they do, maybe it's on day 25 or 28 or 30. And then the buyer still has 3 days beyond that, which may be enough time to get them all the way through underwriting or get that appraisal all the way done, although the appraisal survives. So there is a notice with A, there is no notice with B, and it's anytime 21 days or more on A. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank
Good.
you.
You're welcome. That's a good one. All right. In this day and age, we have more and more buyers that qualify for the monthly, no problem. They've got great jobs. They just don't have a lot of money in the bank. Their savings patterns haven't been real great. They're paying off student loans. They just finished school, whatever, but they don't have a lot of money in the bank and they don't have a rich grandma. So they need a little help. And you can ask for financial help from the buyer using paragraph 3, which is at the top of page 2. This is an awesome, awesome paragraph to be able to assist your buyer because you're in effect asking the seller to give you money at closing or give your buyer money at closing that they can use for anything they want that's related to the purchase of the property. And let me walk through this. Seller shall pay up to, you can say $10,000, $20,000, whatever you want, or you can do the percentage. Little side note, most lenders limit a seller contribution or how much the seller can contribute to the transaction to 3% of the purchase price, okay? So if you have a purchase price of $500,000 and you put in 3%, then $15,000 is going to be the maximum that the seller can contribute according to, these are underwriting guidelines. This is what the lender is saying. You can ask for more money, but the lender's going to say, yeah, sorry, Morgan, we can only use 3% of that. That's the maximum. So FHA has different amounts, VA has different amounts. And so if you've got, this is why it's great to have a good relationship with your lender to be able to say, hey, my people need a little help with the down payment. What's the maximum amount I can ask in the form of seller contribution? And get that information from the lender, okay? Don't wing it, don't guess. There's all kinds of different loan programs out there. So this is going to be a joint effort between you and your lender to figure out how much money you're going to ask the seller to pay. But look at the beauty of this. That money will be applied to buyer's loan and settlement costs, which means pretty much anything in the transaction, including prepaids. Prepaids are, so when you close, they prorate out property taxes, let's say. And right now we are going into the second half of the year. And so the buyer, the lender is going to ask for the buyer to put some money into escrow to fund that property tax account so that when they come due in October, there's going to be money. Well, if you've asked the seller for some money, you can use that money to fund what's called a prepaid or a property tax. It's not a loan cost, but it's money the buyer still has to bring in at closing. They also have to bring in money for an insurance, property insurance, right? You can use that for this. Loan discount. You've heard us talk about interest rate buy downs, right? So maybe the interest rate right now is 5%. Maybe you want to do a buy down to buy down that interest rate to 4.5% so your buyer can qualify. Again, you got to work with your lender on this, but there's going to be a cost involved with that buy down. Any money that you ask the seller for can be applied to that. This is something that is actually you need to be really familiar with right now because this is a great way. Now that interest rates have popped back up, although they did come back under 5% for the first time yesterday. I don't know what they're doing today. But they're maybe you have a buyer who was pre-qualified at 4.25%, and now the interest rates are at 5%. So that definitely reduces their buying power. But maybe you can buy down that interest rate with the help of a good lender, and that lender is going to tell you what that cost is going to be. So you need to learn about buy downs. You need to learn about adjustable rate mortgages. And again, this is a conversation to have with your lender. Loan fee. There's usually a loan fee of 1%, 2% associated with making a loan, and that's 1% of the loan amount. An interest rate buy down we just covered, financing, closing, or other costs allowed by lender. It's it's pretty much anything the buyer has to bring in at closing can be covered by this. So this is just a nice gift from the seller that's going to be transferred, and you're going to use it at closing to zero out a whole bunch of expenses on the buyer's closing sheet. This is a great, great tool. You may not have as much negotiating power. Again, it depends on the property, how long it's been on the market. Is it overpriced? Has there been a lot of activity? If it's a hot property, you may or may not get a seller to give you what's called a seller concession. And so one tactic that some people use, and you have to be careful about this, is to go in and ask over asking price. So asking price is 500, and you go in and offer 515,000, but you ask the seller to pay $15,000 towards closing costs. So it nets the seller the same 500,000 full price that they were asking for. The only caveat to that, can anybody tell me what it is? What would be a glitch? What would be a glitch? We go in over asking price. What could be a problem?
If it doesn't appraise, then it's an issue.
If it doesn't appraise. So I go in and I offer 515 and I ask the seller to pay 15,000 so they can net their 500, and the appraisal comes in at 500,000. Now we have a problem. Now we need to go back and negotiate with the seller and either get them to come down in price to 500,000, or the buyer needs to bring extra money to the table, which kind of defeats the purpose. Maybe you negotiate away the 15,000. Maybe you land somewhere in the middle. If you can't come to a meeting of the mind, the transaction fails, the buyer gets their earnest money back, and everybody goes their merry way. Okay, so that's the only caveat with that. So you need to be able to run your comps in advance and know, hopefully, that the value is there on the property that you're going in over full price on. All right, the amount shall include the following costs. The lender is prohibited from collecting. And now we're going to get into government loans, FHA, USA, USDA, and VA loans. VA prohibits the buyer from paying their half of the escrow fee. There's some other things. So again, especially if you're working with veterans, VA loans are a whole different animal. They're great loans. They are great loans. They can be used over and over and over again by a veteran once they're paid off. They're reinstituted. You can go use them again. You can get in with zero down. They're really great loans, but they do have some caveats that are built in for the protection of the borrower that you need to be familiar with. Earnest money. If buyer has not waived and is unable to obtain financing after a good faith effort, okay, they can't stonewall that buyer and not provide him any information that's been asked. That's not good faith. And believe it or not, good faith effort is a legal term. Then on buyer's notice, this agreement shall terminate. The earnest money shall be refunded to buyer after lender confirms in writing. And here's what Annie was talking about. The date the buyer's loan application for the property was made, including a copy of the loan estimate that was provided to the buyer. Remember I said that 5-day period is super important, that they actually provided everything that they needed, and it triggers a disclosure from the lender. Well, if you're going to try and get your buyer out of the contract, you need proof that they made their application and that they got disclosed. B, the buyer possessed sufficient funds to close. They can't come back in and say, oh God, Jody, there was a really sweet deal on a Ferrari last weekend and I paid cash, so now I don't have the money for the down payment. Okay. And again, I'm telling stories here, and I know they sound kind of funny, but I will tell you, your buyer will remember, don't go spend money on a Ferrari. Here's something you need to tell your buyers when they're buying a house. You do not have my permission to go buy anything for over $100 without talking to me first, because you will not believe how many buyers go out. They buy new furniture for the house. They buy new draperies for the house. They go out and buy a new truck to haul all the plants that they're going to do for the landscaping for the house. And now they don't qualify. So you say, no, 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 no. You can't do any of that. You can't go to Macy's because they're having a great furniture sale. You can't go down to Deal Ford and buy a new pickup truck because they're having a special Labor Day sale. You do not have my permission to spend more than $100, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but seriously, without checking with me first. You don't want to run up your credit cards. You don't want to take on any more debt, because where we're at right now, we are underwritten or we are approved by the lender. But if you go do all that, they're going to take that approval back and you're not going to qualify anymore. And I know that sounds really silly and basic, but again, I cannot stress enough that it isn't, because I've seen too many deals die because of that. And the reasons the buyer was unable to obtain financing. Maybe they had crappy credit. Who knows? So if the seller terminates the agreement, the earnest money shall be refunded without need for such a confirmation. So if we go back to, I'm not sharing, shame on me. Okay. That's all right here in loan provisions. This is where you would fill it in. This is where you fill your percentage in. So earnest money, if the buyer has not waived the financing and is able to obtain financing, this is where all of this is, because the buyer is going to say, how do I know if I can't get a loan, I'm going to get my money back? Right here. So you need to be able to go right to this part of the contract and say, as long as you do the following things, your earnest money is protected. And if you can't qualify, you are going to get your earnest money back. Now, if you just change your mind, I can't get your earnest money back. So you need to be sure before you make the offer that this is going to be the house for you. Now we're going to cover, what if the appraisal comes in low? Appraisal less than sales price, because your buyers are going to want to know about this as well. And this isn't just first-time buyers. Any buyer is going to want to know that they're, in their mind, not overpaying for the house. Does that mean that if an appraisal comes in low, the value is not there? No. Because what is value? Willing buyer, willing seller. And you had a meeting of the minds. However, the lender is going to want to go out and look at comparable sales that have sold in the last probably 3 months up to 6 months. And these are closed sales, not properties that are active on the market, not properties that are currently under contract, usually. These are actual closed sales. What's the problem with that? The problem with using closed sales on an appraisal, I call it looking in your rear view mirror. It's activity that has already taken place. 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago, we were in a completely different market than we are now. It's not as big of a problem today as it was a year ago, because what was happening a year ago? Property values were going up leaps and bounds. So if I'm using properties that closed 2 months ago to try and justify the value of a property that is under contract today, and the market has gone up 5% in value, that's not going to be reflected in the properties that closed 2 months ago. Today, we're in a more balanced market. We're not seeing as many low appraisals, but this is still a discussion to have with your buyer. If it's less than the purchase price, the buyer may, here's your 3 days again, after receipt of a copy of the lender's appraisal, which yes, they will get. They can either give notice of a low appraisal, which I don't always recommend, or you can simply just go, you being the buyer broker, can simply go negotiate with the listing broker. The notice of low appraisal, the reason I don't like it is because it only gives you the option of doing negotiations one time back and forth. And if you can't come to an agreement, the deal dies, it terminates. And that's not always what the parties want. The parties want to come to some kind of an agreement where maybe the buyer comes up a little and the seller comes down a little and they meet in the middle, or the buyer says, no, I really want the house. I've got the cash. I'll pay the difference between the low appraisal and the purchase price. Or the seller says, I really need to get this property sold. It was really nice we had an offer for $515, but I'm willing to go back down to $500, which is the appraised value. And so the seller drops. So they can meet in the middle, the buyer can pay more, the seller can drop their price, or option number 4 is still termination because you couldn't come to an agreement. If it terminates, the buyer is entitled to their earnest money back. That's all spelled out here in what happens. There is something called a reappraisal or reconsideration of value. I'm not going to get into that today, but you literally can go back and ask the appraiser to reconsider if you've got different comparables, or you can go back to your lender. Worst case scenario, you switch lenders, and that's the only way you can get a new appraisal is by switching lenders, because once a lender has an appraisal on their books, they are not going to let you get a second appraisal. So if we're using the notice of low appraisal, the seller has, and look at how far this drags out. They got 10 days. So the buyer has 3 days after they get the appraisal. Then the seller has 10 more days to give a notice that they're either going to get a reconsideration or a reappraisal. They're going to reduce the price down to the appraised value, or they're going to meet in the middle, or the seller is going to reject and say, pound sand, I'm putting it back on the market. I think it's worth it. I think you just got a bad appraisal. Buyer has 3 days from the notice of whatever the seller is going to do, or if the seller doesn't answer them within the 10 days, then the buyer can waive the financing and move forward, or terminate the agreement and get their money back. If the seller says, hey, I'll meet you in the middle, I'm going to reduce it down to something more than the appraised value, then the buyer has 3 days to accept and also show they have sufficient funds to make up the difference or terminate. So there's lots of termination going on here. But it really does protect both parties. And if the seller does consent to reduce the purchase price, oh, I just covered that, sorry. And if either party, this is interesting in our purchase and sale agreements or in our contracts with the Northwest Multiple, inaction by either party, in other words, they don't answer. They don't give you a form, they don't answer, is as if they disapprove whatever you're asking for. So if you ask for the seller to reduce the purchase price and they don't answer, it's like they said, nope, pound sand, we're not reducing the purchase price. Says the closing date shall be extended as necessary to accommodate the foregoing times and notices, because trust me, if I sat down with a calendar and walked you through all of these dates, 3 days here, 10 days there, another 3 days, another 3 days, and remembering those 3 days are business days, I think I counted it out one time and it's like 24 days, worst case scenario. Appraisals usually come in within about 10 days from closing, and all the parties may not want to extend out to get these negotiations. It's better to pick up the phone, call the listing broker. Hey, we got a low appraisal. Here's what my buyers are willing to do. Talk to your sellers. I'm going to go ahead and submit maybe on a form 34, negotiation on the price. Talk to your seller and see what we can do. This is where the importance of good relationships come in. Inspection. This is a little known one, and I just had it happen the other day. So the lender has the right to call for inspection. So you may get through your actual 35 inspection contingency, and the appraiser may call for what we call a roof certification, that there's at least 5 years remaining in the roof. Maybe the inspector didn't call it out, but the appraiser has the right to. The seller has to permit the inspections, but the seller is under no obligation, not obligated, to pay for such inspections unless otherwise agreed. They are also not under any requirement to pay for any of the repairs. That is a straight negotiation. So if the appraiser comes in and says, I need a roof certification, you get a roofer out there and they say, nope, this roof is shot, you need a new roof, it's going to cost you $8 grand. The seller's under no obligation to pay that $8,000. So you know. FHA, VA, USDA, they do what's called an appraisal certificate. One interesting thing about FHA, if you have an FHA buyer and you get an FHA appraisal and it's low, that FHA appraisal stays with the property for 6 months. So if your transaction fails and the next buyer that comes in is FHA, they have to use the same FHA appraisal that you used, that you had. So they're going to be dealing with a low appraisal right out of the chute. VA mandatory clause, it's protection for the VA, and I'm not even going to cover the last one because it never happens. It's a legal requirement. So I am now through the 22AR and the financing addendum, and that just took us 1 hour and 15 minutes to cover one form. Anybody have any questions before I move on? I've got a couple more things to cover. Making sense? Is this financing making sense to you? Okay, good. We have what is called so you say, I want to change loan types or I want to change lenders. How do I ask for that? This is where you go. Actually, there's another form that goes with this. this is where you get the seller's consent to change loan type. This is where you get the seller's consent to change lenders. Find it. Well, let's just go with this one for now. Loan lender change addendum. So what you're going to do if you've got the buyer is you're going to fill this out. You're going to check a box, either or both. Your buyers are going to initial it. You're going to send it off to the seller. It's a request. It's a unilateral request. If the seller signs it, you now have permission to change loan types and or change lenders. We have something else that you may have heard us talk about, and it is called a 22EF. This is something that can be used in lieu of a financing addendum. So let's say there's a really sweet property that came on the market, tons of activity, you know it's going to go over ask, and it is the absolute perfect house for your buyers. They've fallen in love with it. They say, this is the house, I have to have this house. And you know, maybe you're up against cash buyers. Now they need to get a loan, but they're putting $500,000 down. They make $25,000 a month. The lender says, oh my God, they're so pre-approved, it's not even funny. We're not worried about the appraisal, says the buyer. Why would you use an evidence of funds as opposed to a financing addendum? Well, a financing addendum, if you're a seller and you're sitting there and you're looking at two identical offers, one has a contingency that the buyer has to go get financing, and one says, we're just going to write you a check and you're going to be done. Which one do you think the seller's going to take? Well, they're going to take the cash deal. So how can you help your buyer who needs to get a loan get on more equal footing with that cash buyer? And in lieu of using a financing addendum, you're going to use something called a 22EF evidence of funds addendum to purchase and sale agreement. Why would we use this? Because back in the residential purchase and sale agreement, there is a paragraph that says that the buyer warrants that they have sufficient funds to closing, and other than what they've disclosed, they're not relying on any other outside sources. So if you're getting a loan, you have to disclose it or the contract becomes invalid, right? So you have to disclose if you're getting a loan. So you either use a financing addendum or you throw out the financing addendum and you use an evidence of funds. How does this one work? Well, first of all, we go through the definitions. What is evidence of funds? Number one, these are monies in a financial institution in the United States. The reason I point this out is because a lot of times we may have foreign purchasers from other countries, Canadian, whatever. If their funds are in a bank that is not a US bank, you would be in default if you didn't make a change to this form. So what would you do? Well, we had a Canadian client the other day. We simply struck the United States and wrote in Canada. Or we said, can you get the money transferred down here to your US bank account? You can do either one of those things, but you can't ignore this if the funds are not in the US. Non-contingent funds. Non-contingent funds means funds buyer currently has in their possession and there's no contingency such as financing. They don't need to get a home equity loan. They don't need to borrow against a 401k. They don't need to borrow against a retirement account. And the buyer's going to say, wait a minute, you know, those are my money. I put that money in the retirement account. All I have to do is make an application and they're going to give me the money. But you still have to do something and it's not in your bank account currently. Those are not non-contingent funds. Those are what we call contingent funds. So the sooner you can get your client to put their money into their bank account, their savings or checking account, the better off you're going to be. And then it spells out contingent. It's funds the buyer doesn't currently have, but expects to receive from another source prior to closing. This could be gift funds. We're going to spell this out in a minute. So evidence of non-contingent funds. So if they have the money in the bank, this is the box you're going to check. Buyer is relying on non-contingent funds for payment of the purchase price. Buyer shall provide evidence to seller of such funds within 3 days. You can make that 1 day. How do you provide evidence? Well, bank statement with a account number redacted is always a good thing, and that's probably the most common way of providing. But the other thing I say is, why in the world would you wait 3 days to get them that? If you really want your offer to be strong, I would submit that bank statement with your offer, showing how strong your buyers are. And side note, let's say they need another $500,000 for closing or $1 million for closing, and your clients have a bank statement that shows they have $15 million in it. I'm being ridiculous, I know, but how do you think that's going to affect the seller when they look at your offer? Now you have just put your buyer on the same level as a cash buyer. So, buyers shall not use non-contingent funds for any other purpose other than the purchase of the property without seller's prior written consent. You can't go buy that Ferrari. So in other words, once you've verified the funds are in the bank, you can't go spend them on something else. They have to stay there until closing. Let's say you have contingent funds. Let's say they are going to borrow against a retirement account. Let's say they are going to go get a HELOC on their home. Let's say they are going to sell their truck, or they're getting a gift from grandma. Any of those things are all covered right here. They're getting the HELOC loan, or they're getting the gift, or they're going to sell their pickup truck, or they're getting a gift of $500,000 from grandma, or other funds not readily convertible to liquid United States funds, or other. This might be borrowing against my 401k, borrowing against my retirement account. This is the tricky sentence that you need to watch out for, because it says buyer shall provide evidence to seller 10 days prior to closing that the funds relied on in section 3 have been received. So maybe they are getting a loan on the house. They're getting a purchase loan on the house, but they don't want to make their offer contingent on their getting a purchase loan for the house. This is where they would disclose right here that they are getting a loan, but this is not a contingency. So if for any reason they fail to get that loan or the property doesn't appraise, they still lose their earnest money if they don't close. So this is a much stronger position for a buyer to be in to go up against a cash buyer. So you can get a conventional loan on a property without using a financing addendum, and this is the box that you would check to do it. But if you get a loan on the property, the odds are the money's not going to be in your client's account 10 days prior to closing, because most lenders fund like 2 or 3 days at most prior to closing. So I would change that 10 days to 1 day. And then you're going to be covered, because if you don't show the seller proof, if buyer fails to timely provide such evidence, then seller can give notice and terminate the damn agreement again. Here we go again. So we don't want to be in that trick box. So do your job, change that to 1 and be safe. Buyer shall provide seller with additional information that, they're coming, or here's what we've got. If buyer disclosed that buyer is obtaining a loan, let's say they are getting a purchase loan, then the seller shall permit an appraisal of the property. If you don't have this and you don't have a financing addendum, the seller is under no obligation to let an inspector go in, let an appraiser go in, let anybody else in the property. You have to have this paragraph. Shall permit an appraisal of the property and an inspection is required by lender. Talks about the different kind. They don't have to pay for it. Here's the important part. If the buyer fails to timely close because contingent funds identified in section 3 are not available, buyer is in default, seller shall be entitled to remedies. In other words, they get to keep the earnest money. This is a wonderful form. When you have a really strong buyer who says, Trish, I want this house. I don't care what I have to pay. I do need to get a loan, but I'm totally qualified to get it. You have to disclose the fact they're getting a loan, but you do not have to make it contingent on them getting a loan. So this is a safeguard to the seller. Maybe you've got $50,000 earnest money because it's a $5 million house, that if, yes, you're disclosing you're getting a loan, but if for some reason they don't get it, that earnest money just goes directly to the seller. There's no conversation at all. Okay. Let me make sure I covered everything else that I got going on here. Let's see. Oh, there's a 22 AD. All right, this is the last one, and then I'm gonna let you go. I know it's Friday and you guys are hanging in there with me. Again, when you want to go in and make an offer strong and you have a buyer who says, I'm willing to pay over asking price, maybe you're using an escalation addendum, maybe you're just straight going in over ask. So ask is 500, your people say, nope, let's go up to 5.25. Well, the seller, and I do need a loan. The seller's going to say, well, that's all well and good, but what if the property doesn't appraise? This came to be more of a concern again back in the market when people were just paying ridiculous prices for properties and it settled down. However, if you are going over asking price, any good listing agent, Kelly is absolutely one of them. She's been on these calls and said she always requires these, will require an increase. This is called a Form 22AD increased down payment addendum. What does that mean? That means that if you're getting a loan and the appraisal comes in low, it comes in below the agreed upon price, that the buyer agrees to make up the difference of the low appraisal up to a certain number, 25,000, 5,000. So in other words, if our price is 515 and the appraisal comes in at 510, you're $5,000 off. If you have an increased down payment for low appraisal and the buyer's already agreed to pay an additional $5,000, then you're done. You don't even have to go back to the negotiating table. The buyer has already agreed they're going to pay an extra $5,000. What happens if you've got an agreed upon price at 515 and the appraisal comes in at 490,000? Now you're 25,000 off and you've got a buyer that's only agreed to pay 5,000 difference. Well, you got to go back to the negotiating table because you now have 5,000 is already agreed to. So you're left with a $20,000 shortage to negotiate with the listing broker. So that's how that works. And it talks about notices. Seller has the right to reduce the price or terminate if you can't come to an agreement. And we're not going to talk about that. So if you're using the financing addendum and you're going over asking price and you are getting financing, this is always a really good form, a 22AD, to have a conversation with your buyer about making up the difference between the agreed upon price and the appraised value. And it's a set amount going in. Maybe it's 2,000, maybe it's 5,000, maybe it's 50,000. It's whatever the buyer is willing to pay to make up the difference over a low appraisal to get them towards the higher asking price. That makes sense? That was a lot. Okay, I'm going to ask a question. I want everybody who's got their camera turned off to turn them back on. Thank you. Yay, I want to make sure your smiling faces are here. Good job. Good job. Yay. Oh, you are there. You don't know how weird it is talking to a blank screen with a whole bunch of names on it. Did you learn something today? You feel a little more confident about financing? You know now the importance of having a really great lender to lean on, because that lender is going to be your traffic director when you draft this contract. You cannot draft a good contract, I don't think, without one. They are your partner. They are the one who is going to direct you on the down payment and any seller concessions that you want, and how strong your buyer is and how they're cooperating and getting that information in. And if they can't qualify for the loan, your buyer can't qualify for the loan, that lender is the one who is going to help them get their earnest money back. So, and it's great to have a great relationship with one lender, but I say share the love, spread it out a little bit. It's always good to have a couple, because one lender may be really, really good at one thing, but you may have another lender who's really, really good at another thing. You may have this guy over here who's great at construction loans and conventional and high-end portfolio lending for great, strong buyers, but then you got somebody over here who's really good at government loans, VA loans, FHA loans, first-time home buyers. They have the patience of Job. They're going to help that buyer, take them by the hand, and they're really going to get it. So I think relationships are the key to this business. Sorry. And that goes for not just lenders, but title and escrow people. And again, it's always good to have one. I like to have 3 or 4. You never know when you're going to need to switch lenders, or you're going to need to switch. And it's not uncommon. We have had situations a lot where we get halfway through a transaction and that one particular lender comes back and says, sorry, we can't do this loan. So you get on the phone and you call a couple other lenders and you find somebody else who says, hey, I can do that loan, no problem. We're going to move the loan over here and we're going to proceed to closing. You're going to get the seller's permission to change lenders. You're going to move forward and you're going to close your deal. So this is all part of your professionalism, is knowing who to call when. And if you don't know, lean on your team lead, lean on me, lean on Laura, whoever that may be. I used to be a lender in my old life, so I know a little bit more about it than the average person. But I don't, and I've got pretty good relationships with at least a handful of different lenders. That's part of my job, and it should be part of yours too. So, okay. Have a phenomenal weekend. I just want to look really quick and see. I think we have another class Monday. Yep.
Yes.
One more on Monday. And then we're going to take a break for about a week and a half. So Monday morning, 8:30, bright and early. Thank you guys all for showing up. I really appreciate it. Makes me feel good. You guys are going to be
Thank you,
awesome.
Lori.
Thanks, Lori.
Okay. Have a great weekend.